Good morning, and thank you for joining us. OSHR will have a special presentation to celebrate Disability Employment Awareness Month. Our guest speaker is Brian Ingram from the National Disability Institute. His presentation will address disability and employment, the case for hiring, strategies for inclusion, and he'll provide NDI Lead Center, National Center on Leadership for the employment of economic advancement of people with disabilities tools and resources to leverage and support inclusive policies and practices benefiting North Carolina workers and employers. Before we go further into today's program, I would like to do some housekeeping. ASL interpreters and CART captioning will be available for this event. To view the captioning, please click on the multimedia viewer button on the panel. This panel includes participants and chat. If you have issues viewing the captioning, please send a message to the host. As always, keep your microphones on mute throughout the entire session. Please send all of your questions to the chat room. The chat room will be monitored, and we will work to make sure all of your questions are answered in an orderly fashion. This session will be recorded, and you will be able to view this program later on demand. Speaking of on-demand recordings, you will be notified of this program's availability and all of our recent programs when they are ready to be viewed. We are pleased to announce the following upcoming programs. November 7th, American Indian Heritage Month. November 16th, Transgender Awareness. We look forward to seeing you there. There will be more programming in the winter, and we look forward to those programs and we'll keep you posted. I'm going to turn the program over to Lisa Coffey of OSHR, and she's going to introduce our guest speaker. Lisa?
Yes, it is my extreme pleasure to introduce Brian Ingram today. Brian is the Technical Assistance Liaison for the National Disability Institute. He is a nationally known subject matter on the integrated resource team approach and on working with partners in and outside of the workforce system to assist individuals, job seekers with multiple challenges to employment. Ingram has over 25 years professional experience in the fields of disability and employment and has provided technical assistance to businesses, vocational rehabilitation, and workforce agencies at a local, state, and national level. So, Brian, we are delighted to have you here and hear your expertise and experience in this area. So, without further delay, I'd like to turn the mic over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa, and it is great to be here today. And I'm not seeing the PowerPoint. But thank you for having me. And it's great. I mean, thank you. I think it's wonderful that we are able to talk to EOCs and human resources folks from your state. And I think the topic today, which is disability and employment, is going to be helpful and hopefully educational for you all. But before we dive into the topic, I want to talk a little bit about who I work for, the National Disability Institute. So next slide, please. So the National Disability Institute is a national nonprofit organization that's dedicated to building a better economic future for people with disabilities. So this focus kind of puts us in a lot of different areas, one of which is, of course, employment, which is where I focus, but also around economic independence and development. So we do a lot of work with banks. We do a lot of work thinking about how folks with disabilities can acquire assets and move forward on a career path and become financially secure and independent. We are the first national organization that was committed exclusively to championing economic empowerment, financial education, and asset development, leading to financial stability for all people with disabilities. So we try to affect change through public education, policy development, training, and technical assistance on innovative initiatives. Next slide, please. Now, if this sounds interesting to you, we have a link here that you can follow to find out more about our organization and all of the things that we do. And I do like to read this because it does kind of sum up what our vision is, and I think it's important. NDI envisions a world where people with disabilities have the same opportunities to achieve financial stability and independence as people without disabilities. Okay, next slide. We are going to dive into the agenda. So today we're going to take a look at disability and employment. We'll start with an introductory section where we're going to look at the expense of having a disability, which is something people don't always think about, but very real, and we have numbers. We have data. We're going to talk a little bit about the education and experience gap that happens when people with disabilities are trying to enter the workforce. We're going to talk about some challenges that people with disabilities face around needed means tested benefits. And, you know, it's right there in the title. They're means tested, so income can be challenging. We're going to look a little bit at the case for hiring people with disabilities. We're going to look at how people with disabilities are a vast and untapped labor force. We're going to look at how disability is the one demographic that includes all the others. So it's really essential if you're trying to reach diversity and equity goals. And finally, we're going to think a little bit about how being up to date, fluent on strategies for hiring disability can really help you with ADA compliance and other kinds of compliance as well. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Now look at this. This agenda is so robust, there's 2 slides, right? Because we're not going to just tell you all about that without giving you some strategies. So we're also going to look at strategies for inclusion. We're going to look at some things you can do to make your process for recruitment more accessible. We're going to look at where you can find applicants with disabilities, qualified applicants with disabilities, so network and pipeline development. And we're going to think a little bit about flexibility in not just the hiring process, but also in training and management. And we may even touch on the customization of tasks and descriptions around job descriptions. So stuff that's kind of near and dear to your heart. So let's start today by introducing you to some concepts that are going to get you thinking. And what I'm hoping is that it will make you eager to learn more. So let's go to the next slide and dive right in. Disability and employment. So this is a big topic. And as I said, today is meant to be more of an introduction to it. So I want to start today by just thinking a little bit about disability and poverty, because this is a really good way to set the stage for everything else we're going to cover today. Next slide. So here's some bullets that are hopefully going to make you think. The first one is people with disabilities are more likely to be unemployed and to live in poverty than any other single demographic group in the United States. So there are a multitude of reasons for this. And one of them, of course, are challenges related to getting and obtaining a job, employment, which is kind of what we'll focus on today. Bullet number 2, public benefits programs for people with disabilities, especially supplemental security income or SSI through Social Security, are not aimed at increasing assets or independence for people with disability. In fact, as I've said before, they are means tested. So it is very challenging for people who get needed supports from SSI to accrue assets, and it's challenging for them to have income. Now, this would all be well and good if those SSI benefits provided enough to live on, but of course they do not. So it puts people who receive these benefits in quite a conundrum. Finally, the presence of disability and the need to maintain a public benefit should not require one to forfeit their economic stability and live in poverty. And that's really kind of what we're all about at NDI. It lines up perfectly with our mission. And that statement is true. There are strategies, there are ways that people, even who are on means tested benefit, can have income and can accrue assets. So we'll talk a little bit more about that today. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite slides, the expense of disability, because it's something I think that people who don't experience disability rarely think about. So many of the challenges facing workers with disabilities are economic, and they may not be directly related to the disability itself. So for example, as we were mentioning before, working age adults with disabilities are twice as likely to live in poverty as those without disabilities. Um, it's a big deal. You don't have income coming in. And so because you don't have income coming in, you don't have the capacity to do a lot of things. And in fact, next slide, please. Here's some of additional impacts of the expense of disability. So households containing an adult with work-related disability or a disability that happened at work require an average of 28% more income, which works out to an additional $17,750 a year over the median household income to obtain the same standard of living as a comparable household without a member of disability. So that's a really interesting number. On average, it is almost $18,000 more expensive to live with a disability than to live without for an average household. The second bullet is across all racial and ethnic groups, a lower percentage of people with disability have saved for unexpected expenses compared to people without a disability. So almost half of households with a disability had no credit compared with 1/4 of households with no disability. So this is painting a picture. And the picture that it's painting is that it is much more expensive to live as somebody with a disability. And yet it is much more challenging to have the income you need to have that standard of living. So let's think for a minute about what these expenses could be. And just off the top of my head, I can think of medications, treatment and supports related to their disability. I mean, that's certainly part of it. Let me give an example. Transportation, if you're somebody who cannot drive for any reason, you either have to use mass transit, which is sometimes a solution for areas that have mass transit, or you have to think of another way to do it. And quite often that way costs money. That's additional money. So if you're trying to get to work, or if you're trying to get to appointments, or if you're trying to leave your house at all, that may be an expense that other people don't have to incur. You might have a disability that leads to occasional or unexpected hospitalizations. Insurance is going to cover part of that, but there are going to be expenses associated with each hospitalization or each incidence where you needed urgent or emergency care. And these things can really add up. It can also be medications. Sometimes medications are not covered by insurance, or sometimes you're on so many medications that the copays can really add up. So these are just some examples of how disability adds to expense. What I'll say about the second bullet is that no savings, if you're not able to save, if you are not able to plan for the unexpected, it means that there's no margin for error. It means that if your car breaks down, now let's assume that somebody can drive, you don't have enough money to get it fixed. This can lead to the loss of a job. I've seen it happen many times. It means that if you incur that unexpected medical expense, you have to go in debt to meet it. And then that adds to the whole picture. You also have no ability to take advantage of unexpected opportunities. I was just talking with a gentleman the other day who is working and is quite good at the work he does. He's in the financial industry, and he got offered a really great job, but it was in a place where he could not access the supports he needed to be successful. So he had to let that job go by the wayside, and he had to stay in the job that he was in. Um, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but that's a pretty common story that we hear. Let's spend a little bit more time thinking about what I like to call the opportunity gap. Next slide, please. So opportunity gaps are the ways in which people with disabilities face unique challenges in accessing educational and employment opportunities. So some reasons for this are limiting assumptions that are made about a person's abilities and capabilities, uh, using inadequate or inaccurate expectations. So that is an across the board issue. That's something that happens at every level. Sometimes the person with disability makes limiting assumptions. Sometimes the people who are working with them do. They assume that certain pathways are not available, or certain things are not realistic for somebody. And, this starts in school. So often, folks with disabilities get limited or no work experience as a young person, unlike their peers without disabilities. So like I said, this can be because of low expectations for these folks moving into a career. If the bar is set at you're lucky to have a job, nobody's really talking to you about how to enter a career. This also can lead to the fact that they don't get any work experience in high school. And that is really a challenge, because a lot of people start working in high school. They start their work experience. And sure, they may not have a great job that's going to lead to a great career, but they're learning how to work, and they're learning about what is available to somebody without further training or education, right? Um, which means oftentimes that by graduation from high school, people with disabilities are already well behind their peers in experience and career direction. So this actually extends into post-secondary sometimes, because a lot of times, even if a person with disability gets to college, they're not working while they're in college. They don't have a lot of work experience. They do not get access to things like internships. They do not tour facilities, you know, and it works out that once again, once they graduate from college, there's an experience gap from between them and the students that don't have disabilities. So limited work experience impacts folks' ability to compete in the job market for even well-trained or college education applicants with disabilities who are otherwise qualified. So these gaps are going to extend into the workforce. And when folks are looking for work, they're going to start two steps behind everybody else. It's going to mean that they're going to have more limited opportunities to get that job. They're going to have limited opportunities for advancement once they're in that job. They're not going to be considered for lateral moves. I think this is important. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but essentially, that normal flow into a career is interrupted or not made available to folks with disabilities. They also have limited opportunities to move in between industries, again, because of this experience gap. So next slide, please. People with disabilities also face unique challenges around financial capability. And, since we're NDI and our focus is financial independence, I would be negligent if I didn't take a moment to think about the financial challenges that are often faced by people with disabilities. So a lot of times, people with disabilities are going to experience negative credit score, negative credit report. A lot of times, this is just because they have never had credit, right? Because credit can interfere with some of their means tested benefits, and people don't think to give them to steer them towards that. Lack of a bank account is another issue. if you're not allowed to save, or if you think you cannot save, there's not much of a reason to have a bank account. We'll talk more about this, but as far as people who are on means tested benefits, there's a limit to how much you can have in your bank account, which is $2,000, which is not much. So if it's more than that, it's counted as an asset and it works against your eligibility for the services. Oftentimes, because of these benefits, somebody might get into an overpayment situation, which is when Social Security figures out that they have given you more money than they should have, and they garnish your future cash benefits to pay back what is owed. So that can really impact somebody's income. There's also a lack of investment in financial education, education for a career, and education on benefits planning. Meaning, if you can't save and if you can't access assets, it makes everything harder. And I want to take a minute to talk about benefits planning, which is pretty interesting. I mean, so Social Security has work incentives, and what these are ways for you to temporarily get around some of these limits around income and assets in order to help you to work, bring in an income and become more independent. But they're pretty challenging to apply. Actually, they're so challenging to apply that there's a special certification that's really hard to get. Like, you have to train for most of a year just to be certified to guide people through them. So that's pretty challenging. And that's kind of what some folks are facing. Next page, please. Okay, so we just spent a lot of time discussing the challenges people with disabilities face. They're substantial and real, but there's a lot more to this story because there's a lot of benefits to hiring people with disabilities for them and for the businesses and organizations that employ them. So I want to take a minute and make sure that we go over some of them. Next slide, please. Even more good news, right? There are people with disabilities who want and are qualified to work. And there are many companies today that want to become a workplace that's welcoming to people with disabilities. In other words, you want to be a place where somebody with disabilities can be hired and be successful once they're hired. They want to be recognized in the community as a place where people with disabilities want to work. Because we'll talk a little bit more about that, but people with disabilities is a huge demographic, and any organization or company is going to want to be known or understood or seen as a place where people with disabilities are included. Finally, they want to see people with disabilities grow into leadership roles in their organizations. And I hope that your organization is one of those, because as we talked about, it is particularly challenging for people with disabilities to move forward on a career path. And a lot of companies and organizations today are working to change that. And that's really good news. So let's look at some numbers. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned earlier, people with disabilities are a huge demographic, and they represent a largely underutilized workforce. So 1 in 5 families have a member with a disability. 35% or 22 million working age adults experience disabilities, and these are the ages between 16 and 60. That's how we're defining working. In 2019, there were 41,089,958 people with disabilities, representing 12.7% of the total U.S. population. So if there's so many businesses and organizations wanting to hire people with disabilities, and so many job seekers with disabilities needing and looking for work, what's the problem, right? Where's the challenge? What's going on? Why isn't this working out? Well, that's where you as human resource specialists or EOCs can come in, because it's your job to get the applicants with the right skills and experience into the positions that will benefit both the organization and the applicant, right? Because there are predictable ways that we're missing each other. The job seekers with disabilities and the organizations that want to hire them. And these are ways that can be pretty effectively and directly addressed. So looking at some of these is what we're going to be doing in the next section. Next slide, please. I'm a myths about disability and employment, and I touched on some of this a little bit earlier, but it's good to state outright. The first myth that we're going to cite here is that people with disabilities don't need to work once they're on disability benefits. And folks, that is just not true. It makes it more challenging to work if somebody's on disability benefits because a lot of them are means tested. But the amount of cash most people receive on SSI or SSDI is not enough to support themselves. In fact, most people with disabilities that I have worked with who have expressed an interest to work with me, they're not even concerned about those cash benefits necessarily. It's because they wouldn't have to work very long or hard to get paid much to have a lot more cash than they get on Social Security. What they need are those medical benefits. That's what's important. And a lot of times it's a matter of life or death, right? They cannot have a gap in medical coverage. It's very dangerous for them. So let's dispel that myth right now. People with disabilities need to work as much as anybody else does, unless they want to live in poverty. Another myth is that people with disabilities don't want to work. I almost don't want to grace this with a response, but I will. I think this myth comes from the fact that it is more challenging for people with disabilities to find and keep employment in a lot of ways. A lot of people feel like disability benefits are more than adequate to support somebody when they're not. But I think what people often forget is that employment is one of the main ways that people are connected to other people, to their community. People with disabilities don't just want to work. People with disabilities need to work for a lot of different reasons, that I just mentioned. And finally, this last bullet, people with disabilities are not allowed to work. This again goes back to those mean tested benefits, or work more than part-time and keep their benefits. This is really not true. There is a built-in incentive for people who are on benefits to go to work and improve their economic standards and their basic lifestyle. If you're on means tested benefits, it makes it more challenging to do so, but being on means tested benefits is also a prime reason that you want to. So I hope you're starting to get the picture. We don't really have time in the context of this presentation to get too deep into it. But these are things that are myths and they get in people's way. So I hope that at the very least, you won't embrace these myths. Next slide, please. Here's some more data to consider. And again, this is really about the size of the demographic. So in 2019, there were 41,089,958 people with disabilities that represented 12.7%. And that rises significantly when you look at people who are 65 years of age or over. But it's still pretty significant when you're looking at working age people too. One thing I always like to say is disability is the one demographic that anyone can be a part of at any time. You don't have to be born with your disability, you can acquire it. So it's a very big demographic, and thinking about it is really important, especially when you're thinking about diversity. Because again, it's the demographic that includes all the others. So it doesn't matter who you are or what community you're a part of, there is a good chance that you might experience a disability as well. Again, employment, 19.3% of persons with disability were employed, which hasn't changed a whole lot since the year before. And that is in comparison to 66.3% of persons without disability being employed. So that's a pretty big gap. And that's really what we're here trying to address today. I think when, all the time we spent looking at the numbers is to really kind of make you think about how people with disabilities are a huge and growing demographic, and they are hugely underutilized in the workforce right now. They're out there, they're qualified, but they're not getting connected. Next slide, please. This is just some more numbers. I like numbers. I think they paint a picture. This is just comparing the employment rate of people with disabilities against people without disabilities. And it's interesting. Again, working age 16 to 64, 29.1% of people with disabilities are employed versus 70%. 16 to 19, it's 17.3 to 28.9. I'm not going to go through all of these, but they all pretty much tell the same story. People with disabilities are employed at a much lower rate than people without disabilities. And this is one thing I'm here to tell you too. There are qualified people with disabilities. There are people with skills that could be employed in the workforce. There are people with education that could be used by organizations and businesses that are just not being connected. Next slide. Okay, enough about data and enough about the situation. Let's look at some strategies for inclusion. What can you do? Well, what we like to recommend is that especially HR and equal opportunity professionals such as yourselves revisit your staff recruitment, onboarding, training, and retention strategies, using an eye for increasing access and accessibility, and see what you come up with. Because a lot of times it's how you're doing things. It's not what you're doing, it's how you're doing it. So let's take a look at a little bit more specifically at what I mean by this. Okay. The first thing we should look at is recruitment. So that is, where are you posting things? It's your promotional materials, job descriptions. It's how you're getting the message out. So what we're recommending is that you take another look at your recruitment strategies with an eye towards accessibility. So the place to start there is, what does your recruitment message indicate? And I kind of feel like, I've worked with some businesses and I've worked with a lot of nonprofits. And a lot of times when it comes to recruitment, kind of what folks are looking for is to screen people out more than screen them in, because what they're looking for is a very well defined, targeted kind of applicant that's going to meet their needs as quickly as possible. You're looking to get the right applicants in there. So a lot of the things that agencies and businesses often do when they're recruiting is actually designed to discourage people who aren't qualified, rather to encourage people, and rather than encourage a wide variety of people to apply. So one of the things we like to recommend is to look at that those outfacing materials, and make sure that you are giving the message that you are encouraging people with disabilities to apply, and that you can handle it if they do. Things like, one of the things I often see is a job description that is very specific around experience and very specific around skills, that at the very end says, we encourage people with disabilities to apply. So I guess one of the things we're thinking about is, how can you present these outreach materials in a way that is inclusive to people with disability? How can you share the message that you are encouraging people with disabilities to apply, and that you're willing to accommodate them in the process of interviewing, and that your organization is going to be a safe and effective place for them to work? The second box is, does the outreach get to where qualified individuals with disabilities will see it? We'll talk a little bit more about this, but thinking about where you're reaching out to can be as important as what you're reaching out with. So do you are you making your local vocal rehabilitation agency aware? And I don't mean just posting it, on the state job site. I mean, have you reached out directly to your vocational rehabilitation partners to make sure that they understand what it is you're looking for, so that they can spread that news to folks who might be qualified and assist them in getting connected with you. I mean, that's just one example, but there's a lot of room usually in outreach to target who this is getting to and how. Are you working with other organizations that are working with people with disabilities? Are you approaching them directly? Um, you can think about job descriptions. So job descriptions are really, really specific, and there's a reason that they're really specific. It's important that they're really specific. But a lot of times in that specificity, what gets translated is that it's also not negotiable. And a lot of times job descriptions are negotiable if you think about it. You're going to list every skill that's needed. You're going to list every duty that's a part of a job, right? In a job description. But in reality, there's going to be parts of those responsibilities that are more important and key than others. Uh, there's going to be multiple ways that somebody can get to those outcomes that they may not have thought of. So one of the things we like to encourage folks to do is to look at your job descriptions and maybe include some language that indicates that accommodations are possible and actually just fine with me. So, if there's a communicate, like if one of the requirements is, superior communication skills, don't just leave it at that. Break that down a little bit and say yes. And those communication skills can be, uh, this requirement can be attained in a variety of ways. It can be attained through using accessible technology. It can be attained through um, accommodations. It can be attained, there are multiple strategies for this. And spelling that out in the job description, that's a really good way uh, to indicate to an applicant with disabilities that you will be a good place for them to work. Again, along these lines, use every opportunity to communicate your willingness to accommodate. So not just a tagline at the bottom of the job description or the posting. Um, Actually build it into the descriptions if you can. Make sure you mention it when you're interviewing folks, when you're reaching out to them directly. Make sure that they know that you want to know what accommodations are going to work for them, and you are more than willing to discuss how to get it to them. Okay, next slide, please. So let's take a look at screening and interviewing specifically. The first bit is to expand your own understanding and internal awareness about disability. So it really helps if you know what's possible. You've done your homework. Um, it if you know what if you know what accommodating technologies are available and how to connect people with them, if you know something about the challenges around working on means tested benefits, you don't have to be an expert, but it is really a good feeling for an applicant if they know that you're aware of some of the challenges that they might be experiencing and you're open to working with them to address that. Again, this is something that if you're comfortable with it and it is just going to cross over into everything that you do with those applicants. We encourage you to state the availability and opportunity to request accommodations multiple times in multiple contexts. Uh, because it's, if you think about it, it's not an easy thing to do. Uh, an applicant that experiences disabilities may feel like asking for accommodations is going to impact them negatively as they are considered for a job. And, there's not a lot you can do about that assumption except to emphasize and underline the fact that you are encouraging people to request accommodations because you want them to be able to perform at their best level. And it's good for you to think about, how are they going to know how to ask? I mean, are you telling them more than just accommodations are available upon request? Are you giving them some context where it's appropriate to ask, when you would like to hear about it? I mean, do you want to hear about it in the resume? Do you want to hear about it in the interview? Do you want to hear about it again? So I think you get my point. How will applicants know it's okay to ask? Again, our recommendation is always to ask everybody, which means don't just ask people you think have a disability or who have indicated that they have a disability. Ask everybody. You know, they can always say no, it's not that big a deal for them. But if they are somebody that has a disability, the fact that you're asking everybody makes it easier for them to disclose. And it makes it easier for them to tell you what their accommodation needs are. And again, try to do it in multiple contexts. The final box is my favorite. Don't hesitate to consult with the applicant about what works. And I use that language, what works, very deliberately. Because what I'm saying here, what we're saying here is you don't say, I see you have a disability, how can we help you with that? A better way to frame that is, how can we help you to be successful? You know, accommodations are available. Let me know what works for you and how we can set this up in a way that is going to work for you. That's true. That is definitely true for the interview. Different people need different supports around interviewing sometimes. And if you think about it, that's for the best. That's the best for everybody. You know, that's the other thing I like to say, which is this shouldn't be viewed as something extra you're doing for somebody around compliance or because they have a disability. But it's something that's going to make that interview more effective for everybody. You're going to get a better idea of what this person's strengths are, and they're going to get a better idea of what it might be like to work with you at your organization. Okay, next slide, please. So another thing to think about is the workplace itself. Um, and it's important to have an accessible workplace. And of course, that means make the workplace physically as accessible for employees and customers. I think this is something that a lot of people consider. It's the most likely thing that organizations and businesses are going to consider when they think about having an accessible workplace. Can somebody in a wheelchair use the bathrooms? Do the doors open automatically? Are there desks that allow for a bunch of different heights? You know, they're adjustable desks, that kind of thing. And that is very, very important. And it should be considered. But as EOs, you probably are very aware of that, right? You should make accommodating technologies available for employees and customers. So it's always nice to, you know, every software program now has a suite of accommodation supports in it. I mean, you know, Word's getting kind of amazing actually, with what can be done. So make yourself and your staff aware of what you have that's available around accommodating technologies. And also, again, don't be afraid to ask what works best for somebody. It might be something you haven't thought of. And it also might be something that they can bring. I know a lot of people with vision impairments and who are blind use JAWS, and JAWS comes with you. As long as your technology is accessible to it, you don't have to do much at all. You just have to, you know, make sure that that person has access, that they're going to bring it. The next bullet is build flexibility into organizational procedures and processes. This is a little bullet, but it's a big concept. One of the things we recommend to agencies and businesses all the time is you've got to be able to flex. You've got to be able to make exceptions. You've got to have a process in place that allows you to accommodate people's needs if you want to do that successfully. So, do you have multiple ways of training people to do things? Would you be open to somebody who said, hey, I know you train me this way, you intend to train me this way, but I would really like to be trained in this manner or like to have this support connected to the training? Is there flexibility built into how you communicate with each other? Is there flexibility built into what you do and how you do it? Because flexibility is the key to accessibility. And systems don't tend to trend towards flexibility. They tend to trend towards unit oh, I'm losing the word here. Make standardization, that's the word. So standardization is good for a lot of things, but you're going to run into situations, not just with people with disabilities actually, but with everybody, where building in a little flexibility will save you a lot of grief. So that's something to think about. Finally, build an awareness of inclusion and flexibility into the culture of your workplace. So that's the other thing that, you know, we always try to emphasize. If you intend to be flexible and you've built the infrastructure to be flexible, it's very important that the people who work for you understand that flexibility is not just a possibility, but it's something you're encouraging in certain situations, and that they know how to apply that flexibility. And if you do that, then eventually that will become part of the workplace culture. And people like the EEOs won't be involved nearly as much as they used to be directly, right? Next slide, please. Part of this would be creating a welcoming environment. And this slide lists a few strategies for developing internal champions. And again, this is really about the workplace culture. So one of the things you can do is create affinity groups, support the creation of affinity groups in your organization. So this can be about anything, but of course, in this case, we would think it would be about employees with disabilities, where they get together and they talk about their experience, and perhaps they come up with ideas that they can share with you about how to make your process more inclusive and more accessible. Reaching out directly to the disability community. We talked a little bit about this earlier. Reaching out to your local VR, your local workforce, letting them know and understand that you're interested in applicants with disabilities. Reaching out to disability-centered organizations of any kind and let them know that you're interested in hiring people with disabilities and you're interested in those referrals. Take the time to understand the strengths and needs of your employees. One of the things that comes from universal access is a really strength-focused approach, meaning the best way to increase productivity, efficiency, and access for all people is to really build on their strengths and put them in places where their strengths can be applied. If this attitude is adopted organizational wide, business wide, you're not only going to be better able to accommodate and maximize the impact of your employees with disabilities, but you very well might create an environment where you're positively impacting the performance of all your employees. Next slide, please. So this slide's talking about accessible recruitment strategies. And we'll go over them really quickly. There's a lot more information about these than I'm going to be able to give you today. So reverse job fairs. Now you might be familiar with job fairs where employers set up booths and applicants go visit the booths and they get a chance to learn about the job and the employer and perhaps even talk to somebody who represents that employer. Well, a reverse job fair is just that. It's when the applicants set up a booth where they highlight their strengths and they talk about where they want to work and they talk about what works best for them. And employers visit those booths. And this is kind of a simple reversal of what is normal, but it really can have a big impact because it really helps both the job seekers and the employers to understand where somebody might fit into their organization. And it can be very effective. Affinity groups, again, we talked a little bit about this on the last slide. So affinity groups are groups within your workforce that share interests in common, and disability might be one of those. And again, they get together to talk about what works and to make sure that that the organization or the business knows what's working and knows what needs to be addressed. It's just a good, safe way for folks with similar affinities to support each other. It's a very simple thing to set up and it can have a big impact. Finally, there's workforce development. And I've talked a lot about, this has come up on a lot of different slides. And this is where I'm going to take a slightly deeper dive into it. Workforce development can really, really help bring you folks with disabilities. This is based on the supports they provide and the services they provide to people with disabilities. So they can help you to set up informational interviews with applicants. They can help you set up internships, which can be super useful to address those experience gaps that we were talking about earlier. They can set up on-the-job trainings, again, which is a way to address those experience gaps and those education gaps. On-the-job training is where somebody starts a job, gets trained for a job, they're actually on the payroll, they're hired, but that workforce development organization is going to be paying the wages during the training period. So it's a way to minimize risk for everybody involved. And workforce development might have a variety of apprenticeship programs, hopefully that are actively engaging people with disabilities with specific skill sets that you can connect with. So these are all things that workforce development can provide to an organization or a business. Next slide, please. We at NDI feel like that is such a positive avenue to connect people with jobs with people with disabilities workforce that we put this slide in too, which kind of outlines some of the employment disability partners that might be in your community that you might want to connect with. And right at the top of the list, of course, is vocational rehabilitation. So vocational rehabilitation is the training and placement service that is exclusive to people with disabilities. So you have to experience a disability to be eligible for it. And it's pretty cool because they have a lot of expertise and a lot of funding to fund disability specific solutions for people looking for work that experience disabilities. So it might be a way for somebody with disabilities to, let's say, set up an informational interview, set up a on-the-job training. It might be also a way for them to pay for accommodating technology or bring in an expert that's going to align their technology with the technology an employer uses. It's, what vocational rehabilitation can do is broad and really helpful if you're an organization or a business that wants to employ people with disabilities. So there's the American Job Centers. So these are our friends at the employment department and our friends that are handling the Title I training programs. They are folks, people with disabilities are eligible for these services. And again, they can get training, they can get assistance setting up, addressing those experience and educational gaps that you might find with applicants with disabilities. And they are in every community across the nation. So again, if you don't have a good relationship with your job center, with your workforce center, with whatever they call it, the WIOA services, we strongly recommend that you do make that connection. There's also employment networks. So employment networks is a system of vocational providers that are set up to serve people on Social Security benefits to help them get back to work. Employment networks, it's not as uniform as vocational rehabilitation or the job centers. They're not in every community, but they are in many, many communities. And it is their job to help folks that are receiving Social Security disability benefits to move off of those benefits through employment. So they are a really, really good set of people to talk to if you're interested in finding applicants with disabilities that are going to meet your training and experience requirements. And they can provide support to those job seekers as they go through your process. Finally, there's work incentive planning and assistance programs, or the WIPA programs. And these, again, are run through Social Security, and they are the certified benefits planners that I talked about earlier, who can help somebody take advantage of Social Security work incentives to help them to maintain their benefits while they're going back to work and then transition off of those benefits in a way that doesn't impact them negatively. So again, look up your WIPA and get in touch with them. That's a great way to get in touch with applicants who are qualified with disabilities. All right, next slide, please. Again, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about NDI's inclusive employment solutions. So we offer technical assistance, tools, and resources to help improve employment services and outcomes for people with disabilities. We have a really qualified staff, and we are very willing to work with organizations and businesses to develop strategies that are going to work for them. So if any of this sounds like something you want more of and you're interested in looking us up, please contact our Inclusive Employment Solutions and we can talk. All right, next slide, please. Look at that. Questions? Made it to the question section. Let's see. Do we have any questions?
Actually, before we get started with the question and answer segment, and it may be a little short, but I just wanted to let you know that a lot of people, I'm getting a great deal of feedback from everyone just saying how informative everything that you've been giving out has been. So they're requesting possibly the slideshow that you presented today. I know that you were prepared to send out links to the resources, but they are also requesting your presentation because it's been so informative for them. So I just wanted to let you know that. And before we begin as well, I just wanted to recognize Laura Glenick. She's been your eyes and ears this morning. So thank you, Laura, for everything that you've been doing on that side. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to present to Brian? Please send them to the chat. Okay, I'm still waiting for some questions here, but before we go on to some other questions, I wanted to find out from your perspective, Brian, the pandemic affected everyone in their situation, including how we work. But with the pandemic, did you see an uptick of requests for consultation or services with the NDI? And how does it stand now if you did have an increase in requests for consultation? How is it going for you?
That's great. That's a great question. I will say, first of all, that of course the pandemic took everyone by surprise. So, at the front end, no. Everyone was in pure reaction mode. A lot of people got furloughed or laid off. A lot of employers were floundering. A lot of agencies and organizations were floundering. As we move forward and adapted, I think some changes happened that long term are going to be huge for job seekers with disabilities. So the ability to work remotely is going to make a lot of things more accessible for a lot of people. I will say that. We're already starting to see it, and yeah, we're getting inquiries about it. We're getting, we just had not too long ago, we had a business contact us because they had decided to go remote. I mean, and there's a lot of upside for going remote. So this was a business that had multiple country, and they came to the realization that if they built their workplace remotely, they could hire from anywhere, right? For any office, and it hugely broadened the pool that they were able to pull from, and they were able to get more qualified people. But as a part of this, they realized that this could have a positive impact on their ability to diversify their workforce as well, both with the fact that they could pull from many, many places, many pools of labor, but also specifically around disability. So this is a really exciting time, I think, for job seekers with disability, with a lot of opportunities coming up. And we're really hopeful that, even as the pandemic measures end, many employers and many organizations are going to keep that option for remote working open. And folks with disabilities are going to be able to take advantage of it. I don't know if that answers your question perfectly, but
Well, it does answer my question. And again, the feedback that I'm getting is that a lot of your presentation, it was so packed with information, and it was so complete that they don't have a lot of questions. They just want to get your presentation so
goodness.
that they can follow up with it. But I do have one question. This will be our last question, and we'll have to wrap it up. Is there a checklist of modifications, for example, that an organization can put into place to accommodate people with disabilities? Do you know of a checklist?
I know of hundreds of checklists, and that's part of part of the answer to that question. There are definitely some basic things that you can do to make your workplace more accessible, and it's on they're covered in the ADA, and EOs should be pretty familiar with them. They're the physical stuff, and making sure you've got a suite of accessible communication strategies that are available to everybody. But beyond that, I'm sure we can come up with some lists for you. But beyond that, I think the thing to remember is that you can take 20 people that experience the same quote unquote disability, and all of their accommodation needs are going to be different. So what's truly important is that you build in the flexibility into your process that you can get at what works for people, and that they can get what works for them in a way that's going to work for everybody. And again, that may not be exactly the answer you were looking for. But it's kind of where I tend to go, because I think in a lot of ways we're poorly served by checklists. Because you can have the best checklist in the world, you can have everything in place, and you can still miss a lot of people if you're not flexible enough to catch their needs. So.
Right, and that's a good point, because one of the things that I experience, I teach a ADA class, and we talk about this a lot, is that you need to make sure that you have your eyes and your ears open.
Yep.
Because that's the main way that you're going to be able to identify if there's a situation that accommodation may be needed. Because a lot of times they don't use the words or terms accommodation, reasonable accommodation. They're just asking for help. So we have to keep our eyes and our ears open. I did want to take this time again to thank you, Brian, but also to thank the members of your staff that are present today. And I also wanted to thank our cart captioner and our 2 interpreters today for our program and participating in our program and providing their services to make this a program that everyone would be able to view and to catch be a part of. And I wanted to say again that because of Executive Order 92, we are an employment first state. And so having you here today just solidifies that as well, because as an employer, the state of North Carolina, we are about actively recruiting, hiring, and retaining employees that have disabilities. So again, during Disability Employment Awareness Month, but also throughout the year, please make sure that you are looking for employees that have disabilities, or looking to employ people that have disabilities, because they are also great resources to add to your workforce. And I would just like to conclude this program, and on behalf of the state of North Carolina, again, thank you, Brian, for your presentation today. I will get all of this information out to people that are attending today's webinar. And we would like to again thank you for presenting. And again, throughout Disability Employment Awareness Month, just make sure that you are looking at how you can better accommodate individuals with disabilities. I'm going to conclude this program today and look to see this posted online. Thank you and have a good morning.
Thanks, everyone.